Great to see people from around the globe, variously at 2 a.m. and at more sophisticated hours in the UK. But everyone is welcome, but particularly those that are linking in from the UK, from the US. So nice to see you all, and I hope we're going to have a very good evening. Now, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Mark Diserio. Where is he now on my screen? I can't find. There he is. And he's going to give us a talk on this wonderfully titled, and to someone in America, of course, this expression is far more familiar than it is to us outside America. The expression gubernatorial, which I think is used more than a little in the US. But Mark will be talking to the Queen's Men Gubernatorial Frank Stamp. So Mark, over to you, and I very much look forward to your presentation. Thank you, Mark.
I hope this works.
Looking good.
Hang on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Yep.
Okay, because I can't see a thing on my screen. Well,
Have you
good
started
evening.
sharing?
Sorry?
Don't forget to share the screen.
Oh, hang on.
Here we go.
Is that all working? Okay.
Yep. And just go from the beginning. Yep.
Yep. There we go. Well, good morning, good evening, lunchtime, wherever you are. Hang on, I'll just move. Okay. Great. We've got a lot of slides to get through, and my wife accused me of running this as a one of those show card things. So I'll try not to linger too long on each slide. And if you've got questions, perhaps you can put them into the chat room, and then Frank can deal with that at the end. Now, most of you or all of you are intelligent, so I will let you read the slides that have text on it rather than reading it out for you. And after a reasonable time, I'll move on. Now, in Victoria, as I've said, there are 8 different types. 4 of them are rare, and 2 of the rare ones apparently are only known on 1 or 2 covers. So the majority of Governor Franks are of type 1, 3, 5, and 6. And of those, probably Type 6 is the commonest, followed by 5, followed by 1, and then followed by type 3. The type 7 and type 8 are quite subtle differences, but because there's only one of type 8 apparently known, it's unlikely that it's going to be something causing a lot of confusion. On this slide, I've given an indication of the type of flap seals that can be encountered on the Victorian Governor Frank envelopes. There's quite a few. Interestingly, these 3 across the bottom right all belong to Governor Brassey. This one here was used by the Lieutenant Governor, and I'll talk about that a bit later. Obviously, that's quite a bit of a standout. This one here in embossed without colour, and this one Victoria, are the earliest used. Although this one makes an appearance in the 1890s during the Depression, where I think the government was emptying out the warehouses for stock, because this was a seal that was certainly used very early on in the period. The first Governor Frank actually wasn't a Governor Frank. The governor was left out of the first allocation of Frank stamps because he wasn't covered by the relevant legislation. And I think that was due to the fact that the government felt that the governor was above all of the use of a Frank stamp. After all, he only needed to sign his name on something and it went free of postage. But it didn't take long for the governor to work out that he wasn't going to sign thousands of ball invitations. And this example here is an invitation to Queen Victoria's birthday ball, and you can see it was under cover of the Chief Secretary's Frank stamp. So this was in the period before the governor received his Frank stamp, which was later in 1865. Interestingly, I speculate whether the addressee is none other than the famous Jonathan Bear of the advertising envelope fiasco. If it wasn't him, it may well have been his father, who was of the same name. On this slide is the apparent earliest recorded date of a Governor Frank, and this was used by Sir Charles Darling to Sir Henry Berkeley. He had previously been Victoria's governor up to 1863. And John, this is for you because it's addressed to Mauritius, where Berkeley was then the current governor. This next slide is a little excursus off the topic because it's not a Governor Frank stamp, but as we will see as we go through the presentation, there were many instances where the governor was on leave or had finished the term of office, and there was a period between the new governor, the old governor leaving and the new governor turning up, and that the person in charge of the government in that period was known as the administrator of the government. So, for example, administrator of the government of Victoria, or as we will see later, administrator of the government of Tasmania. And This frank stamp was discovered by Ben Palmer, lurking in the Powerhouse Museum, but there's no evidence that it was ever brought into use. And during our period, Brigadier General Carey was the administrator for the period indicated on the slide, and there is certainly no usage of this by him. Indeed, there is no usage at all during his period of administratorship, and it's possible that he may have used his own frank stamp as the commander of Her Majesty's Land Forces. Now, the next governor to use a frank stamp was Sir John Henry Manners Sutton, and this is a vellum part cover from some of his dispatches back to London. And it's interesting that even though he uses the frank stamp, he still signed the cover at the bottom left. And probably this is instructive of something that you'll see through this exhibit, and that is we start in the 1860s and we end up at the period of Federation. And of course, during that time, we had the telegraph come to Australia, we had regular shipping back to England. And what we tend to find is at the early stages, there's a preponderance of what might be regarded as official mail. But by the time we get to the end of the exhibit, most of the mail is social, and most of the frank stamps, I think, are being used on invitations to various functions. Sir George Bowen was the next governor. Interestingly, he acted for a short time as administrator before he was formally appointed. And here are three covers indicating usage by him. I have a quote from Victoria's colonial governors, which I think sums up Governor Bowen. And it said, "There is plenty that was distinctive about Sir George Bowen, his governorship and the period in which he was governor of Victoria. And if there had not been, he would still have told his acquaintances about it." According to that book, he was a prolific correspondent, and that's quite instructive. It's evidenced by the addressees. I particularly like the one on the left, which is to Sir Daniel Cooper in Sydney. He, of course, went back to England at some point, and I'm not sure if he became a philatelist in Sydney or when he went back to England. And then the next cover is to Sir William Gregory, who was another colonial governor of various colonies. And then, not to leave out the normal administrative duties of the position, he's written to the police station in Stawell. Now, this next cover is apparently unique with that frank stamp. I say unique advisedly because someone will always come out of the woodwork with one, and that would be wonderful if that happened. This is also interesting because it's got an adhesive stamp added, apparently to pay carriage from Adelaide to Perth, where it was addressed to Sir William Robinson, who was then the governor of WA. We'll meet him many times as we go through this exhibit. Again, the Marquis of Normanby, as he was known, was administrator before he was governor. These are two usages by Normanby's wife. One to the daughter of the Bishop of Wellington on the left, and this one is to Mrs. Levy. The Levys were socialites in Melbourne at the time. Mr. Levy had a very high position in the Chief Secretary's office. We now move on to Governor Locke. As I indicated at the outset, he appears to be the governor who used the most number of different frank stamps during his term, and I've recorded 4 different ones. Of this slide, my particular favourite is the cover on the right, as this is addressed to Princess Diana's forebear at Althorp Park. And if that isn't interesting enough, it's from the Royal Mint in Melbourne. And at that time, the Royal Mint did not have its own frank stamp. That didn't come till about the 1900s. And this is franked with the Governor's frank stamp. And here are some more covers that instancing different usages during Locke's time. This cover on the left has one of the rare type franks. I've no explanation as to why there were so many at this period, and then why some of them disappear. I don't know whether or not the franks became lost or broken, or even whether they were souvenired by returning governors. Now this slide is showing frank stamps used by Sir William Robinson, who at this point was acting as administrator of Victoria between one of his stints as either the governor of South Australia or the governor of Western Australia. But these were used during his 2 administratorships of Victoria, is indicated, and there was a longer one from March to October and a very short one 2 weeks in November of 1889. Needless to say, I've not seen any covers from that last period. Now we move on to the Earl of Hopetoun, as he then was. And this is again one of the rare frank stamps. And I've shown an unused one, which is unusual for the exhibit, but only because it is such a rare frank. And I wasn't able, I got outgunned in trying to buy the proof that Max Watson sold some years ago. That went to England. And interestingly, so I regard this as a very inexpensive proof. Interestingly, this cover on the left has actually been posted twice, which I don't think any of the previous owners had worked out, but it's actually been through the South Melbourne Post Office more than once, and there are different dates on it. Here are some more covers with different franks. The common frank used by Hopetoun. This cover is signed by him, and this cover is addressed to his aide-de-camp, Captain Ackland, who was also Lady Hopetoun's brother-in-law. There was a lot of that went on in governorships. Various children or relations were often employed as secretaries or aide-de-camps. The next user was Baron Brassey, and then later Earl Brassey. This is an interesting cover because it's from Macedon Upper, and it's clear to me that it was posted while the Brasseys were staying at Government Cottage, as it was called, which was the summer house kept on Mount Macedon, a bit like the summer residences in India, up in the mountains, to allow the governor to escape the hot summers. Here are some more covers used during the governorship of Brassey. I'll quickly go through some of these because they're all interesting in their own way. This one on the left is a cover that it's the only cover I've actually managed to acquire since exhibiting. I was lucky enough to find this on eBay, and it's posted as the arrow takes you to from Warrnambool. On the crest of the envelope is Brassey's auxiliaries, the arms of his auxiliary steam yacht, the Sunbeam, Royal Yacht Squadron. Apparently, if you're lucky enough to be a member of the Royal Yacht Squadron, you're entitled to use the post-nominals after your ship's name of RYS. And this is a picture of Brassey's personal yacht in which he sailed out from England when he became governor with his wife and family. Let us say it's no little rowboat, fully crewed by him. He must have been of immense wealth. And I suspect that he became an earl because he put his hand into his pocket for much of the time he was governor. And I'll come to say a little bit about that later on when I speak about Hopetoun. The cover above the yacht is very interesting because it's been sent to the USA without postage. And apparently it got through untaxed by having the usual Victoria official paid hand stamp placed on the cover, which was usual for most of the mail going overseas, but only to British Empire destinations. The cover on the top right is to the father of Brassey's private secretary. So clearly there was largesse in the use of Governor Frank stamps. And then finally, the cover at the bottom right is to the Viscountess Hampton, the wife of the then governor of New South Wales. I'm speculating that it was probably sent to the Viscountess by Brassey's wife. Now we move on to another period of administratorship, this time by John Madden, as he then was. He was the Chief Justice of Victoria and the Lieutenant Governor And it became common during this period for lieutenant governors to fill in as administrators. I've given, by this time, Sir John Madden a new slide, because at this point there was no governor of Victoria. We were getting very close to federation, and it was the view of the Colonial Office in London to recall as many of its governors as it could, to give the new Governor General as much free air as possible. It also freed up the government houses in Sydney and Melbourne, which could then be taken over by the new Governor General. This cover at the top right is again one of the rare hand stamps. This is the Type 8 that I indicated earlier. And then we move on post-federation. There's been enough clear air, and Sir George Clark is appointed. But of course, he's not able to take up residence in Government House because that's where the Governor General's living. And he takes up residence at State Government House, which is Stonington in Glenferrie Road, Malvern. And that's where this cover is from. And there's a number of these. This is a nice commercial usage, obviously sending payment for food and drink that's been ordered, or perhaps sending an order in. Now we move on to Tasmania. I hope that's readable. The interesting thing about Tasmania is you'll see that the cover was supposed to have on public service or public service only on it. It starts out that way, and then it ends in a bit of a free-for-all. This cover here is really a forerunner to show you what covers look like before the governor had a frank stamp. On this slide, I illustrate usage of the second of the two types of Tasmanian frank stamps. This is it here. This is a par compliance strike on the second day of issue. And the first Governor Frank was turned into this Office of Taxes frank stamp. And by the end of the period of use, when it was no longer able to be used because of changes to legislation, this is what the frank stamp looked like. So it had a good period of usage. On the other side, I'm showing a variety of embossings or printings on the flaps of the governor envelopes. And this governor, Governor Strawn, was the first to use the frank, and this covers the earliest known that I'm aware of, and probably the finest of such a strike. And then it was used by the next governor, Governor Hamilton. The only thing I'll point out about this cover, it owes its existence to the Reverend Rayner, who was head of this school in Hobart. He then went on to head schools in Adelaide and eventually returned to England, where I believe he became a respected member of the Royal Philatelic Society of London. Then we move on to the 14th Viscount Gormanston. He was a prolific user of frank stamps, and the fact that many of his franks and covers have survived, probably these because they were sent to his bankers in London and no doubt kept in their archive until they were sold off or liberated. This is showing the latest paid hand stamp or Hobart hand stamp, and this is showing one of the earliest of the new official paid hand stamps. Here are some more used by Gormanston. This one is to his wife, who was visiting Adelaide with his children. I know that because there were newspaper articles that you can read about it in Trove. This is an interesting cover because it's been redirected from Rugby to Soden in Germany, apparently without extra charge. These are covers that are used by Gormanston's wife in a distinctive handwriting, and this cover in the middle, in which this was the enclosed correspondence, is a letter about the genealogy of a branch of the Hall family, which may have something to do with Georgina Preston, who was Gormanston's second wife. J.T. Alexander Rawlinson was the private secretary to Gormanston, and here are some examples of usage by him. I would regard these as being official use. Clearly, the one to Walsh and Sons and the government storekeeper, obviously getting supplies of something. And of course, this cover is going to the Governor General of New Zealand. This is an example of the governor being recalled or his term finishing, and the Chief Justice of Tasmania has taken over the role of administrator. These are examples of covers used with the frank during his term. This one here is obviously a record cover of some description. There's not enough of them about for it to be for the UPU, but it's obviously for some record purpose. And then we're back to having a governor again. I've not, unfortunately, been able to find any proper usage during this governor's term, but I do have a copy of this par complaisant sheet showing the Governor Frank on it. The Carman collection had a similar sheet, but he had 27 different franks, where this sheet only has 26. And then we have a fantasy frank, which someone has turned the date wheels to, it looks like 32 November. And that seems to be the last usage of the frank. Then we move on to WA. This one doesn't have as many governors during the relevant periods, but it does have 3 franks as opposed to the 2 from Tasmania. This is a slide showing the variety of arms on the back of the governor envelopes and a forerunner to the frank stamp used in the early 1880s, showing a rather crude Governor WA stamp, in this case used by the then Chief Justice as administrator, pending the arrival of the new Governor of Western Australia. this slide illustrates the three different types of Governor Frank stamp that was used. Interestingly, for many years, we thought the right-hand side franc was the first franc stamp. And that was on the basis of the red crown on the right, which was in the Carmen collection and indicated as the earliest franc stamp. But that got trumped by this one on the left, which is in May 1893, not October as the other one. And you can see that it clearly is using the large arms. So one thing we can say is that at least two franc stamps were being used at the outset by our friend Governor Robinson. This was his third appointment as governor of WA. He was clearly popular with the government in London, if not the colonials in WA. Carmen postulates that Robinson got the idea while he was administrating Victoria, and Carmen also speculates that Robinson probably brought the franc into use before the legislation had been passed. The next governor was Governor Smith, and I can only say that this governor is quite a character. We'll meet a few more on the way, but this one's certainly a character. And this is an example of the large arms and the hand stamp number 8 of Rio de Rihi. That's this hand stamp here. Governor Smith is looking quite gubernatorial in that photograph, but let's have a look at the way in which the press of the day viewed him. This is Governor Smith per a cartoon in one of the local newspapers. He was recalled to England due to the associates, the company he kept. And apparently he was sued by some of his co-business men in a failed pub in Perth. Anyway, it's not surprising that this cover is sent from Nanine on the Murchison Goldfield, and the other cover is sent to Johannesburg. I only speculate that it had something to do with gold. It may not have, but he certainly liked to make things more important than they need be, because let's put 2 Governor Frank stamps on it when one's necessary. And then probably my favourite period of WA is again an administratorship. This time Onslow, who was Chief Justice. I may remark that the picture of Onslow is by Tom Roberts. Apparently this is a study that Roberts made for a larger painting, and this is in the National Portrait Gallery in Canberra. The cover on the left is private to his family. The cover in the middle is obviously on some form of formal business, and the cover on the right is to the Chief Justice of South Australia. And given the date of February, late February, and the fact that Onslow finishes up in March, it's probably some farewell note to one of his fellow Chief Justices. And the final governor, again, governor has been reinstated. We've now gone past federation, and this is Governor Lawley. I've only seen the large arms used by him, and this is to the Countess of Jersey, and we'll encounter some more covers to the Countess of Jersey later on in the exhibit. Now we move on to New South Wales, which I know is a favourite of Les Lamphere, who's online, and we've been in communication with one another over New South Wales franks. New South Wales is interesting in that for such a short time, there were 9 different types. And also when I started collecting franks, in the New South Wales History Handbook, they only illustrated 1. Sydney Views expanded that with some correspondence from me to the editor. I think we went up to about 3 or 4, and then Hans Carmen did some heavy lifting to bring it up to, I think he's got 6 or 7. Les and I have discovered some other types, and that culminated in a 9th one, and we'll have a look at that shortly. These are the 9 different franks from New South Wales, and there's some minor and major differences. Some of the franks are not used very often. This particular frank, type number 2, only seems to be used in a 1-month period by Governor Hampton. And this final frank, if you just bear that frank in mind, you'll see the similarity that it bears with the Australian frank that we'll encounter later on. This is a collection of type of seals or flap seals that can be found on gubernatorial envelopes of New South Wales. Again, like Victoria, the Lieutenant Governor was the Chief Justice at particular times, and he used his court envelopes on occasion, as did the Victorian Lieutenant Governor. We can see the same here. I'll explain Lilienfels for those of you who are not from New South Wales. This is the first type of New South Wales frank. The reason I share the slide between Governor Duff and Sir Frederick Darley, who was the Chief Justice and Lieutenant Governor, is the fact that Governor Duff died in office in March of 1895, and to my knowledge, no one has discovered any Governor franks used by him. I'm sure they must exist, but since it only had a 3-month window, they must be quite scarce. Lilienfels was the Blue Mountains holiday home of Sir Frederick Darley, and here is a photo that I found of Lilienfels with Sir Robert Duff and Darley and families. Lilienfels was a deceased daughter of Darley. I should say Lillian was, and it's named Lilienfels after her. This next slide's quite interesting, or at least I think so, because the frank stamp on the top left is actually watermarked newspaper wrapper paper from New South Wales. And this slide showing you the watermark on that. Miss Gillies will we'll see the name Gillies later on. She ends up marrying some guy that comes out on the same ship that brings out the new Governor General. So it was Sydney society must have been a very small pond back in those years. Some might say it still is. The next governor was Viscount Hampden. I've shown you the cover to his wife from Victoria. I know Les Lamphir has a particular liking for these particular covers. I think his one's better than this one, but they're both addressed to one of Brand's sons who was in the Royal Navy and in the West Indian Squadron. And this cover has gone through London and been backstamped with a foreign branch en route to the ship. For those involved in trivia, this fella became Rear Admiral, and he visited Sydney in April 1922 and retired as an Admiral in 1932. These are some more covers under Governor Hampton's governorship. The one on the right's to his bankers. We find a lot of governor covers to establishment bankers in London. The one on the left is interesting because it has the thistle and strap and buckle on the back, and it is likely that this cover was sent by Captain Ferguson of the 2nd Life Guards, who was one of Viscount Hampton's aide-de-camp. And I should add, from April 1897, his son-in-law, having married the Brand's eldest daughter in Sydney. Again, indicating that there was a fair amount of largesse in the use of frank stamps. Here are some more usages under Hampton. So I think we're up to maybe 3 or 4 different frank stamps. This frank on the left is one of the more scarcer ones, the ones that I said were only used, I think, in April and May, if that, of 1897. The cover on the right is sent to George Cohen, who was a director of the Australian Gaslight Company, an insurance company, and the commercial banking company, and also Tooth and Co, who were then brewers in Sydney. This is a very, I want to say rare, it's, let's say, scarce envelope size. And I know Les Lamphir's got a couple of these, although his one's better than this. But these large envelopes are definitely used on government business. And this one was to the South Australian Governor's aide-de-camp, Major Guise or Guys, and he was the aide-de-camp to Sir Thomas Foxwell Buxton, who was then the South Australian Governor. It's interesting because on the back there are 2 private secretary New South Wales and a Crown wax seal. So obviously it did have something important in its contents. And how these get out, we don't know, we don't care. We're grateful to have them. I think Earl Beauchamp is probably the most interesting of all the governors. For those of you who haven't seen this exhibit and maybe don't know this, but he was the basis of Lord Marchmain in Evelyn Waugh's famous novel. A very interesting character, and I can only invite people to read a little bit about the 7th Earl's private life. Oh, and before I leave you with that little conundrum, so many of his covers are addressed to female peers in England, which adds even more to why you should read about his private life. Here are some more covers. If I can say, the usual suspects from governors, again, to the bankers, to the aristocracy, the army, and the peerage, Cox and Co, if it's not one of the other bankers. The cover on the right is to a very interesting, again, peer in the UK. And the one in the middle, I put that in because it's probably the rarest of all the New South Wales Franks. It's very similar to the one that looks like it, except the H is right under the scallop. That's the easiest. There's other ways of telling, but that's the easiest way of knowing whether you've got the very scarce or rare Frank. The cover on the left is to George Robertson of Angus and Robertson fame, and it's posted on the day that Beauchamp was leaving Sydney on his long journey back to England. It's well known and documented that Beauchamp was a bit of a patron of the arts, particularly writing, and I think he might have even given Henry Lawson a bit of a hand up somewhere along the line. The cover on the right is another one of these covers to the ladies of the aristocracy. Then we move on again to another administratorship of Daly. Again, we're now in the period where the governor's gone back to England to free up Government House. And this is a range of usages by the Lieutenant Governor. The cover on the top left is the one with the Chief Justice's chambers on the flap. It's initialed by Daly, and it's sent to one of the leading Protestant clergy in Sydney. And the bottom right is to the Chief Justice of South Australia. And you'll recall that there was a similar cover that went from Onslow to the same gentleman. Then we move on to, again, this is post-Federation. And this is one of 2 or 3 covers used by Governor Rawson. And it's initialed by him at the bottom. He is a very, I want to say very model of a modern Major General, but I think he's a model of an Admiral. And I can only commend, if you're at all interested in boys' own adventures, this fellow, I don't know if it was an autobiography or a biography, but he had had the most amazing life, escaped alive from prison in the Middle East. And I can say he would be one of those typical stories of the British Empire at the time. But an amazing fellow, and obviously thought so highly of that they decided to send him to the end of the earth to be the governor. But I believe he was a very successful one. His wife died en route on a trip to, I think it was back to England, and the affairs of state that are run by the governor's wife were taken over by the governor's daughter, and that's a picture of her in this stereo slide. Now we're in the home straight, covering the Commonwealth. We haven't found any records about the usage or terms governing the usage. Let's say it's Rafferty's rules. This slide is to just illustrate the letters patent for the appointment of Hopetoun, the Earl of Hopetoun, this time as the Governor General. He was appointed in October of 1900. So comments that you often see in a particular auction catalogue from a Melbourne house that says, you know, illegal usage or premature usage is absolute rubbish, because of course he was able to use the franc as soon as he arrived, because that's where it had been manufactured for him. Here is a selection of flap seals that can be found on the Governor General envelopes franked by the Governor General or persons not the Governor General. I'll just quickly point, you'll see these as we go through. This is the crown of Queen Victoria, and this is the crown of Edward VII. These are seals of Hopetoun. This one he seems to have used before he resigned, and this seems to have made an appearance after he's made his decision to resign and go back to England before the end of his term. And this one is seen used on the possibly mailed from the Duke and Duchess's ship, but this was definitely used by someone in the entourage of the visiting royals. There's a cigarette card of Hopetoun. The cover on the right, there's our friend Mr. Gillies. I introduced you to his daughter earlier on, and Gillies, this is the earliest known cover, complete cover. The cutout on the left is the earliest known use because it's used in the morning. The one on the right's used in the afternoon. I speculate as to whether this was sent to our Governor Smith in England, but I've not been able to find out Governor Smith's middle name, and I can't imagine that if it was our previous WA Governor Smith that he would be addressed as Esquire, so there must be another Gerard Smith, but of sufficient importance to receive communication from the new Governor General 2 days after he arrives in Sydney, and the earliest known usage. Hopetoun came ashore from the Royal Arthur, and he was not in too good a shape. He picked something up in India on the way. He wouldn't be the first and he won't be the last. This is a cover that's, again, pre-Federation use. This is used on the 29th of December. And I was able, surprisingly, to find a picture of the actual address. And I suspect that that's Madame Perrier standing at the gate. Now we move into the Federation use. The size of these and the flap seals tend to indicate that these had some form of invitation connected with the Federation and the swearing in of the Governor General on the 1st of January 1901, and then possibly to do with a myriad of festivities that went for the whole week. I think the Honourable W.G. Drake was actually, that's not his proper name. I think he was Senator Drake, who was our first Postmaster General. But I've not been able to work out that address. But it's possible that the name in inverted commas is a German steamship that was used, tied up in Sydney as accommodation for visitors to the opening ceremonies. Now, usage of Governor and Governor General Franks outside of the capital cities is most unusual. And this one is postmarked Sutton Forest. And this was the position of Hillview, which was New South Wales's equivalent of Government Cottage in Victoria. And this was owned by the government until 1957, when the government decided to sell it off. I don't know if they were on hard times or whether the place was falling down and it was just too expensive to invest money into. It's now, I think, been turned into an upmarket resort in the Southern Highlands. Here is usage in Brisbane and Hobart, and I'd already mentioned the use from the Royal Steamship, which was the HMS Ophir. That had been chartered for the Royal Tour because none of the Royal yachts could span the coaling stations necessary to get the ship to Australia, New Zealand, and then around the world back to Canada and then home. I've not been able to work out who was visiting Brisbane at the time this was posted. It certainly was not the Hopetons, according to all available records. But as I said, there was quite some largesse in the use of Governor Franks. These are very interesting use of the Frank stamp. On the left is a postcard. This was part of a series that were published in England for the Royal Tour out to Australia for the opening of Parliament House in Melbourne in May of 1901. I suspect that this was someone who was part of the royal entourage and may well have come out on the ship. I particularly like the wrapper on the right to Earl Beauchamp at his family home, Madrefield's Court. Why the Governor General Frank has been added, I can only assume it's to give this cover gravitas, because it's already been paid. It certainly didn't need to go post-free. Here are two official covers, which are franked with the Governor-General frank. Sir James Dixon was the Commonwealth's First Minister for Defence. And given the shape, it certainly, in my view, did not contain an invitation. That's some form of governmental official business. And in the cover on the right is sent to the officer administering the government of the state of Tasmania, who was Chief Justice Stokel, as we've seen from Tasmanian franks. This is an unusual frank according to the handbook, because it's got blue at the top and purple at the bottom, and it seems to be the only recorded bicolour. These are franks that have been used by Countess Hopetoun. Two of them are from Skipton, where she was luxuriating on Calambo Station, which was owned by some of the squattocracy of Victoria. She was the guest of Mrs. Robert Chirnside while she was luxuriating there. Lord Hopetoun was visiting the goldfields over in WA with Lord Forrest, the Premier. And so these are sent from Skipton. One of them's going back to England, obviously personal, and the other's going to the mutual stores in Flinders Street. So that's some form of either paying bill or it says chemist department, so maybe she was ordering some pharmaceuticals. These are more private usage by the Hopetouns. The one on the left is to their eldest son, who ended up becoming the second Marquis of Linlithgow, and he was the Viceroy of India from 1936 to 1943. The cover on the right is by Hopetoun, and it's got his signature at the bottom left. Now, this is a particularly interesting usage by Lord Hopetoun. It's signed at the bottom left, and it's posted from the town that was named after him when he was the Governor of Victoria. He'd made a tour up to a station that was previously a very small town. In his honour, they named it Hopetoun. It's, to my knowledge, one of two towns named after Hopetoun. Hopetoun in Victoria is named after the Governor, and Hopetoun in Western Australia is named after the Governor-General. The contents of this letter are set out on the left. It was all to do with his resignation as Governor, because he felt he couldn't go on shelling out £10,000 each year out of his own pocket to run two government houses and to pay for all the expenses and the entourage that befitted him. And so he resigned his commission, and this is sent to, I think it's G.R. Godfrey, who turns out to be a founding member of the Philatelic Society of Victoria. For those of you that didn't know that, he was a successful grazier businessman, as well as being one of the founders of our society. And finally, we move on to the last of our Governors General with a frank stamp. This is really here by way of an appendix, because by this time Lord Tennyson was not one of the Queen's men, he was one of the King's men. But I just figured we needed to round out the display as well as the exhibit. And he was acting Governor General after Hopetoun had resigned and returned to England. In fact, even though I keep saying he resigned, he did resign. Hopetoun didn't actually leave his post, although he left the post in England sometime well after he'd actually left Australia. Again, this is interesting because it shows another usage of a postcard, this time a Queensland postcard, which was already paid, prepaid. Again, I think the franc is added to give dignity to it. I can find no reason for the governor to be in Brisbane when it's posted. And then finally, the cover on the bottom left, it's sent to the father of the Tennyson Children's governor. Again, showing the largesse. And I don't think frank stamps weren't confined to upstairs. There's definite proof that some frank stamps were used by some, but not all of the downstairs staff. And that's the end of the presentation. I hope I've still got some of you there. I know I've gone a little over time. Frank told me I could if I needed to. Anyway, I hope it's been interesting. It's certainly been an interesting and a joyous 40 years putting the exhibit together, which is how long it's actually taken. And I guess as all of you know, as collectors, often you've got to wait for the person who actually owns it to either dispose of it or die and let their estate dispose of it. And even then, sometimes they're never on the market, or they might even be in a bank vault for many, many years. Now,
Mark,
Frank, what do I need? Do I escape?
Yes,
You just stop sharing.
You've done extremely well, Mark, and thank you for that. And you actually, in your last comments there, really answered one of the questions I was going to start my comments with.
Just
and that
stop sharing, Mark.
Hang on,
Down
how
the
do I?
bottom. Down the bottom.
I'm looking and I'm not finding it. Hang on.
Great presentation, Mark.
It could be at the top, Mark,
I
but
think
it's the
it's got-
green button. Green.
It's usually at the top.
There you go.
Oh, there we
you go.
go.
Sorry for that. I should apologise that we actually had a run through and it worked, but I think at the time it was at the bottom and not the top.
You can move it.
Mark, picking up again, what you said right towards the end of your presentation that's taken you 40 years was really the anticipation of the question I was going to put, because what has been remarkable is the absolute breadth of the various states and then the early part of the Commonwealth of what you've assembled. And it would obviously take such a long period of time to do that. So you're to be congratulated on such a broad span of material, lovely material, but a very broad span. Secondly, from a few of the comments that you made as you were going, you've obviously picked up a lot of the social history related to these governors in your journey. And I think that's one of the great fascinations of postal history, how much you learn about the history of the various states and then the federation. So that's been a byproduct. And the third reasonably substantial comment I would make is how pleased I was to hear of the work you've done with Les Lanfear. I think that's wonderful that between the US and Australia, that this cooperative work, and by a lovely coincidence on my screen, you are side by side as we speak, and that's been wonderful that Les and you have worked together in the way that you have. And I was interested to hear, Mark, you admiring the material that Les has in his collection. So it was wonderful to see. The more general and the somewhat more minor comments was, I don't think the governors of their day would actually have applied these stamps themselves anyway. I think they would have addressed the letter, would have gone off to their secretary. And it's not surprising to me that other people really piggybacked off the use of the stamp, and it was used more generally. So I can't be terribly surprised. But one of the things that I found very odd was the letter from a governor to a Victorian country police station. Now, that struck me as a very odd piece of correspondence. You rather passed over it, but it struck me as one of the odder items. You know, letters to mistresses in London, I quite expect, but letters to provincial police stations, one wonders what was the content of that. Why would a governor be writing? I don't imagine he was being caught speeding in the country. I don't think that would have been likely. So, but it was just an interesting one to me.
Drunk and disorderly, John. Drunk and disorderly.
And the governors certainly knew how to look after themselves, and their country residences in the hills were always perfect examples of that. Very much following the Indian model. In anticipation of this comment, of these comments, I actually dug out one of my books called Running the Show, which was about governors, British governors around the empire. And there's a lovely quote that I'll give to you at the end. May God forgive us for our sorry deeds and for our glorious intentions. They often came out with great aspirations as to what they would do, but didn't always deliver. Mark, you certainly have delivered, and we thank you for that. It's been a wonderful evening, very, very thorough, and an amazing assembly. I don't know where you go from here with it, though. That's one of your great challenges, but you've obviously had a lot of fun, and you've shared that fun and enjoyment and the lovely material you've got with us this evening. So I'd ask you to all join me in thanking Mark for a wonderful display. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was just so pleased to be able to share it with all of you.
All right, John, we've got a few questions. Can I get the questions out of the way? All right. There's a question from Ian Sadler, or comment or question says, so Mark, is it cheaper to send this mail to US rather than Perth?
I cannot answer that. It's interesting. You don't see much mail to the US, although, having said that, there were very close ties with the US throughout all this period, and I know Governor Bowen, on one of his trips back to Australia from England, almost did a speaking tour through some of the eastern states. So there's a lot of connection between Britain and governors and so forth. Now, of course, having said that, I'm reminded of the fact that that was greatly interrupted because of the Civil War, and that if history serves me right, I think the UK was more on the Confederate side.
But Mark, the other thing was that, and this is quite late in the piece, that when we joined the UPU, that as my understanding was that the franking system had no relevance outside the empire.
Well, that's my understanding as well.
Yeah.
I hope, Les, you don't mind me mentioning this, but there's a wonderful cover that's been sent from New South Wales, Frank, with the Governor Frank, and 2 tuppence halfpenny adhesives. It is a magnificent cover, and I regret the fact that I just didn't bid enough. But it's and I also regret that I made Les pay more than he probably should have. it's not in my collection. I just want to say it is magnificent, but it's probably one of the few Governor Frank covers with postage stamps outside of, well, anywhere really. And certainly the only ones I've seen, I show one of them, which was the cover going to Perth from Adelaide. And I believe there's at least one or two inwards covers that have come from England that have been franked, and then a Governor Frank has been added to it, as it were, to send it on its way to another state, if that makes sense. So the frank's been used the opposite way of an adhesive.
Okay, Frank, have you got more questions?
Yes, and Jack Ringles has asked, where does the term Frank stamp come from?
I think it originates in England in the 17th century. I think it's written up. There's a book by a well-known English writer on Franks called Herewith My Frank, and it's essentially, I think, probably originated with someone's signature, but I don't really know more than that.
All right, and Ian Gregg's got a couple of questions to ask you. Ian, over to you.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you for an excellent presentation, really good. And thank you also, because I was looking at my Governor General of Australia frank, which is actually posted to England and has Victoria official paid on it. That's also in the two colours, which I hadn't noticed before. So thank you very much for that. I collect all of Victoria, and trying to dabble in frank stamps as a complete was beyond anything I could imagine. However, what I have concentrated on, and really what my rest of my questions are related to, is Victoria frank stamps and being sent to foreign countries. Now, the actual regulations on that have bemused me for years and years and years, because there doesn't seem to be a definitive answer. And I would love you, if you have time, to try and put a definitive answer together, because there are various sources that seem to contradict each other. The franked book does imply quite a lot in there, and there's some quite strange countries that are included that were valid, but I don't think all the countries you're suggesting in the British Empire were actually valid. So that's part of my question. The second part, which is a cover I've puzzled over for many, many years, and it's a Governor of Victoria frank stamp type 6, posted in London to a chartered accountants with no stamp on it. It also has official paid, Bedford Street, WA, etc. in red, and a Secretary of State Colonial Department in black stamp on it. Now, it really is, where were these actually valid to be used?
Well, wherever you could get away with it. And I think the US, the cover to the US proves my point. That should have been taxed, but it wasn't, because it looked very official. And I think that's half the thing. You bluff your way through. The cover has bluffed its way. But I'd be happy to make some comments on it if you want to email it a scan or something. And I'll take your other question on notice, because I'm familiar with all of the references that you've probably seen about what is an official usage and what isn't. And I'm no better off for having read them as you are. But
well, see, I have frank stamps to Calcutta without stamps. I have one to the USA with stamps, and the frank showing as well, which implies I think it probably did a single rate. I have a cover to Canada, which has got a frank stamp, but it's actually overcovered by a 5-penny stamp. I just go on and on and on. Belgium, it just doesn't make sense. It's totally illogical.
My understanding, sorry, just to have an answer to this. I've got a few of these as well to foreign countries, And my understanding was that the frank stamps were not valid. They're only valid within Australia, but they weren't valid for foreign postage. So everything addressed to a foreign destination had to have postage stamps at the single or double rate or whichever rate it was, and that was across the board, is my understanding.
Well, the UK, I've got dozens to the UK with no stamps on.
You
So
know,
I think
it's quite clear that francs were valid within, if not the whole of the British Empire, to parts of it. But I know I've seen. I don't have it in my collection. I at the time let it go. But there's one to Bulawayo, the Bishop of Bulawayo, and whatever country, whatever colony that was. There's so many of them, but that was not taxed. But as I say, it's most of it's the proofs in the breach. It's really difficult. It's an area where I think you can say without doubt, it really is a question of bluff.
I think that if you have another question, if you think of it out loud, have you ever seen a frank stamped cover taxed?
No, but that's not to say, sorry. The answer is I haven't seen a gubernatorial one taxed. I would have no doubt that one would exist if it's been improperly paid, no doubt at all. But it's in, you know, just talking about, you've just reminded me, the cover by Governor Smith to Johannesburg is sent to, I'm sure that was to the South African Republic. Now, it did have official paid hand stamp on it, and it wasn't taxed. Just like the one to the US had official paid on it. I suspect possibly the post office has added that, and that's been taken by the receiving country as some form of post office, you know, as if it was sent by the post office, you know, because both of those covers, I think, are post UPU period. But I've got to say, I'll see what I can do, Ian, about the regulations and so on. But I think I've seen all the stuff you've seen. I don't think I've seen anything in the archives of any relevance, and I really do think it's what you get away with. And you saw those covers that have two stamps on them. You just make it look more important, and you know, if the postal clerk can read it, they'll think it's really important, and why, you know, it would be an affront to tax something. And after all, the governor is the representative of the Queen, so at least within the empire, that's like the Queen sending it. So,
well, mine are not always necessary governor; they're just general franks. I understood
that.
The other one, just to add,
the reason I understood that, Ian, is you shouldn't have too many Governor Franks.
Just to add to the confusion, I have one which is a General Post Office official letter addressed to the Collector of Customs in New Zealand, which neither has a frank stamp on or a postage stamp on, and has got a Melbourne postmark and has gone through the post.
Well, that would be just postal admin to postal admin, and I think there's probably something in the UPU about that too, in the regs. I'd be certain about that.
Yeah, I think you're right because I collect Postmaster General frank stamps, and I've got a few that go, a few Postmaster General stationery going from one Postmaster General to another, and there's no stamp or frank on it at all.
Okay.
Frank,
this is to the Collector of Customs, not to Post Office. So.
No, but same.
It's official. I agree.
Official,
and I think later on they got very sophisticated and used the French. What was it? Something about on the service of post.
Yes.
And that confused all the British Empire people who couldn't speak French. So,
Okay, Frank, have you got any more questions there?
No, there's no more. That's it. All over to you now.
Okay, well, does anyone want online to ask any questions?
I'll make a comment if I can, John. I collected Frank stamps from Tasmania. I've been collecting them for about 10 years. And every time Mark does a presentation, I realise how weak and pathetic my collections are. And that's occurred on this occasion as well. But I just wanted to back up something that Mark said. You get about 10 or 12 chances a year to buy Frank stamps for the states, or for my particular state, and 60% of them would be the post office, whatever it was called at the time, or in Tasmania, the Public Works Department, or whatever it was called at the time, and the other 40 or 50 hardly ever come up at all. So I think that what you've done, Mark, to collect that many Frank stamps for the governor is just astounding.
Certainly right, Alan. Thank you for that. Anything else before we start getting into just a bit of admin and close the meeting?
Mark, Jack here, just to follow up, since asking that question of the history of the origin of the word franking, I've been onto Wikipedia. They're suggesting that it comes from the Latin word francus, which they suggest means free. Although I'm not convinced that that's absolutely right, because the conversion of free is Libra. So I'm not exactly sure, but Wikipedia believes that that's what it meant, that it was a free use of the post office.
right.
And it also goes on to say that in the 19th century, over a third of all postage ended up going for free for various reasons. I don't know if that's right either, but it's an interesting piece of information.
And Jack, that's why there was a great tightening up, because the whole system became so heavily abused, particularly in the UK. And as Mark, I think all of our rules were really based off the UK, I think, in the main. I think that's right.
Well, the worst abuser of the franking privilege was in England, and that goes back to the original Postage Act of 16, whatever it was. So when the actual General Post Office and all that was legislated,
1660,
because
according
it
to
was all the bishops and clergy and you name it, every sheriff and whatever had a privilege. Like everything, it was all being supported by everyone else who had to pay outrageous amounts per mile.
Yep.
and then turnpike fees and all the other things added on.
Okay, thank
Mark?
you again.
John, I've got just a quick one. I've come across this just while we're looking, and it says it goes back to the French franca, free delivery.
Latin.
Right. Okay.
John,
Liz,
I'd like to thank Mark. This has really been interesting. He should have said the one cover with the stamps on it is going to Samoa. Great destination, even just, by itself. But this has been an interesting area for me. I haven't been at it as long as Mark, but I guess I've been really lucky.
well, that always helps in philately, I've found. Okay, thank you very much indeed, everybody. Now, just a little bit of admin before we close. Announcements. The Bourse is on the 18th of September. That's assuming that we have no COVID restrictions limiting our world. Council nominations are due with the Secretary by the August the 19th. Future meetings, the library, the 31st of August, that's this coming Saturday. I know Richard Brecken is going to be in the library. Peter Leach is going to be there as well. My understanding is if we keep the numbers below 10 and don't get within 1.5 meters of each other, people, if they wish to use the library, should be able to get access on Saturday.
Yeah, as long as there's only 10 in that building, that should be fine.
Okay, the daytime meeting on the 3rd of August, which is the coming Tuesday after that, sadly has had to be cancelled because of that 10 limitation. The postal history group on the 11th of August is actually the first day after a fortnight of these semi-restrictions we've got is supposed to lapse. Now, that of course assumes that we have no major snafus in new infections in the meantime. But the plan is that that meeting goes ahead as planned on the 11th, 7:45, and the topic is recent acquisitions. And on the Philatelic meeting on the 19th of August, the Brighton Philatelic Society Club will be making a display. And I think Ian Sadler's still with us, and he's the man who's going to be running all of that. Is he? Where is he? I can't see him. Anyway, yes, he's there. So that's the program. Well, thank you all for coming. I hope you've enjoyed your evening. It's been a wonderful display from you, Mark. Thank you again. And I hope you've all enjoyed your evening. Thank you for attending and participating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.